Okay, well, it's start time. So I want to welcome you to the webinar this morning. My name is Stephanie Hagstrom, and I'm the Director of Community Development at the Research Data Alliance US. And I want to welcome you all to the RDA US hosted webinar today called Navigating Data Sharing in International Research Collaborations. My slides going. I'll give you a little bit of background about RDA and little housekeeping, and then I'll turn it over to Kathleen, who will be moderating today. So I'll start with the Research Data Alliance. So the RDA is a community of, we just hit over 12,000 members of data experts from 145 countries around the globe who collaborate together in building the social and technical bridges to enable sharing and the reuse of data. Members of the RDA come together through self-formed focus groups, working groups, exploratory interest groups, and they exchange knowledge, they share discoveries, they discuss barriers and potential solutions. They also define policies and test standards. They do a lot. Many of the 97 current active groups have produced outputs to enhance and facilitate global data sharing and reuse. The RDA also has 26 national groups that support initiatives of the members of their region, of those regions, and provide a platform for those regions to interact on a global level. There are also 4 regional groups of the RDA that provide resources to support and sustain the RDA global operations. The RDA US is one of those recognized regions and is represented by 2,500 members who help strengthen the data science infrastructure community. Before we get started, I want to go over a couple of housekeeping items. We will be recording this presentation, and I will be adding a link to the RDA website webpage, and slides will be uploaded on that page as well. We have allotted time for if we have time, for 2 Q&A sessions, one after the first 3 presenters, and then at the very end, there's 3 ways that you can ask questions. You can go to your control panel and raise your hand, and I will unmute you so you can ask the question. You can add it into Q&A on your control panel, or you can put it into chat and I'll monitor that as well. If there are more questions available than time, I will collect those, put them in a spreadsheet, get the answers from the panelists, and I'll send those to you after the webinar. Let's see, I want to thank you all for taking time out of your schedule to participate today. And I will now turn it over to Kathleen to take it away.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. Let me share my screen as I have a few introductory slides. And we're starting on the wrong one. Sorry about that. There, how's that? Can you see the slides okay? Great, great. Well, welcome everyone, and thanks again for taking the time to join us today. I'm Kathleen Shearer. I'm the Executive Director of CORE, which is the Confederation of Open Access Repositories. We're an international organization creating interoperability for repositories around the world, among other things. And today we're going to present to you some of the discussions and outcome from a workshop we had in 2019, in the spring of 2019, and I was the facilitator for that workshop. And the workshop was organized by RDA US, in particular by Leslie McIntosh and Anthony June. So it's been a rather long journey since we had the workshop, and that's sort of due to some bureaucratic issues and staff changes. And so, but we are very happy to be here today to be able to present the results of these discussions we've been having. The workshop was funded by an NSF grant, and the aim really was to address the social and technical challenges in making data shareable and interoperable internationally, in particular in the context of international research data projects. And we brought together participants from a lot of different domains and different stakeholder communities to try to bring all of the issues together in one place that, you know, one might have to address around sharing research data in that context. And so here, I won't read out the names of all our workshop participants, but they are listed here. And we're very lucky also to have several of those participants today giving a small presentation. So, you know, what is driving all of this? Well, there's a very nice quote from our colleague, Peter Pulsifer. The ubiquity of information and communications technology that has emerged in recent decades provides the human race with unprecedented opportunities for making data shareable and interoperable at the global scale, including between nation states, non-state actors, and inclusive of global commons. So I think we all are becoming increasingly aware of the value and benefits of widespread and international data sharing. And of course, that's why we all belong to the Research Data Alliance. Okay, but unfortunately, it's rather complicated. And this is something that came out loud and clear during our workshop. And I think for our context here, it's important to note that there are two somewhat distinct scenarios related to data sharing. One is the sharing of data across an internationally spread out group of researchers who are working on a research project. And the second is, you know, how that data will be shared after the project is over. And so, of course, these two scenarios are very, very interrelated, but they can have some distinct qualities and characteristics. And so for the first day, the workshop was about 2.5 days long. And for the first day, we really spent the day talking about what are the major challenges around data sharing internationally. And we kind of clustered those into 4 categories of challenges: technologies, standards, regulatory and ethical requirements, and data practices. And the second half of the day, second half of the workshop was really devoted to solutions. So I'm going to pause here, and I'm going to turn the floor over to my other colleagues, and who are going to present some of the challenges from their own personal contexts, and also mixed with some of the solutions as well. And then at the end of the webinar, I'm going to present a kind of a framework that we developed based on the solution discussions we had on the second part of the workshop. So without further ado, our first presenter will be Robert Downs, and Bob is a senior digital archivist and acting head of cyber infrastructure and informatics research and development, Center for International Earth Sciences Information Network at Columbia University in the United States. And he's going to be presenting to us about the social challenges of open data sharing and perceptions of risk. And so I turn the floor over to you, Bob. Please go ahead and share your screen.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so can you see my screen okay now?
Looks good.
Oh, great. Thank you very much. So yes, I'm going to talk about the social challenges and also some ways in which we might be able to address those social challenges and perceptions of risk. And I should mention that at Columbia University, we just initiated the Columbia Climate School. So we're in a transition stage right now from going from just the Earth Institute to the Columbia Climate School. And I also want to mention that we operate the NASA Socioeconomic Data and Application Center there. So when we look at the benefits of data sharing, we can see that the data user certainly can benefit. They can, create new data products. They can integrate data. They can test their hypotheses, answer questions, and conduct various kinds of studies, including replication and reproduction, et cetera. Data producers also have a benefit from this because they can extend the value of their research funds and you have others using the data besides the initial study that was conducted with the data by the team that collected the data. And they can provide evidence of the results, et cetera, and receive recognition for their contributions. And society also gains as technology improves, new capabilities come into play, as well as improvements in efficiency, productivity, and speed and impact. When we look at the benefits of ethical and interoperable open data sharing and use, we can see that having the data freely available for any type of use and any type of user is valuable. People then have the rights to use the data in various ways, including modification and redistribution. And they can put the data in various catalogs or to new products and services. It also facilitates open science and enables scientific progress and enables the transparency of the data, and as well as replicability and reproducibility. And other kinds of uses also are enabled, such as planning, policymaking, teaching and learning. There's also contagion going on in that when people are recipients of data, they might want to then share their data with others. And likewise, they also might want to recognize those who are sharing their data. There are some social challenges, though. We need to change behavior. There are entrenched practices in many parts of the world where people have not traditionally shared their data, and the training in science traditionally hasn't emphasized data sharing. There are also some potential risks if the data are inappropriately used, or some people might even believe there's a missed opportunity. That is, if they get scooped, someone else reports before they were going to report on their findings. And there are associated responsibilities with that too. We need to respect confidentiality, privacy, and not divulge sensitive information or personally identifiable information. It also requires an effort. We need to prepare the data in various ways, such as cleaning, describing, and documenting it, getting open licenses, and ensuring that the quality is appropriately documented as well. But we also need to deposit the data so that it can be shareable to others on an ongoing basis. And there are new opportunities and challenges associated with the benefits from data sharing as well. For instance, we need to provide attribution for the data producers. We also need to reward the data producers. And if we're not doing that, then we need to overcome such challenges. Within the international context, there are cultural differences in terms of sharing data, and different laws in different countries, and policies. They could be national as well as local or institutional. And these are all different. And we need to be able to describe the data, addressing the fact that people are coming from different domains, languages, professions, or levels of expertise. And practice also is different internationally. For instance, we all don't necessarily have the same definition for open data as being freely available for anyone to use for any purpose without any restrictions. So when we look about the types of perceived risk of sharing data, some people might believe that there could be a breach of confidentiality, such as the identification of personal, private, sensitive, or proprietary information. So that needs to be addressed to protect such private information or sensitive information. There's also the potential for liability some people might perceive, where they would have to incur costs, and it could be a result of use or misuse. Again, the missed opportunity is a perception, and misuse, where people aren't necessarily reporting on the use of the data in line with the way the producers of the data had envisioned. Also, that resource commitment and the issue of misattribution. That is, if people are incorrectly referenced, or the authors are, or the data is incorrectly referenced, and people could be criticized either fairly or unfairly, and that could be a concern as well. We can address these issues, though, and we now have several principles that help us to do that, such as the very popular FAIR principles for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable data, the CARE principles for collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics, the trust principles for transparency, responsibility, user focus, sustainability, and technology, and the GEO principles, the data sharing principles, and the data management principles. So we can do this by assigning an open license to the data, and some actually offer liability protections and require people who publish using the data to provide attribution for the data. But we also need to clearly communicate the rights and responsibilities for the data, and we need to enable the free use if users cite the data that they use. We also want to encourage users to correctly cite the data if they're using it for a publication. And to do that, the distributors of the data should offer a recommended data citation.
2 minutes, Bob.
Oh, thank you very much. And institutions need to reward data sharing as well as scientific contributions. So data citation provides an opportunity to reward open data sharing. We've seen that article citations are recognized metrics, and certainly we need to do the same for data citations. We also need to improve the status of data citations and work to make sure that people can use the data. So we need to prepare those data adequately and look at the choices of repositories. So in order to reduce the risks, various stakeholders can each take on a role. The data producers, the data stewards, the data users, the sponsors, the employers, and the publishers all need to contribute to this. And as a result, open science can really benefit all of society. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bob. Thanks. So now I'd like to introduce our second speaker, who is Ingvild Constance Mockman. And Ingvild is head of the Research Gateway of the Eurolab at the Jesus Leibniz Institute for Social Sciences. She's a professor of international politics at the CBS International Business School in Cologne, Germany, and also a professor at the Center for Gender Research at the University of Oslo in Norway. And Ingvild will be presenting on the jurisdictional, policy, and cultural challenges of data sharing. So I turn the floor over to you, Ingvild.
Thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me now. I'll just put on the presenter modus. Yes, thank you very much for the kind introduction and also for the invitation to be here today. I would start with one comment that I've been thinking about, also listening to Bob, and which is that I realized that we're actually in a very special community within the RDA, but maybe also in the context of GESIS, which is a research data infrastructure in Germany that probably many of you know. But a lot of these issues that we talk about now is not something that I very often encounter in my national, but also international interdisciplinary research collaborations. And this is, I think, a primary challenge, which maybe we can come back to later on. that what we consider as knowledge known to everybody, or that the sharing of its value somehow doesn't seem to have hit the ground in very many of the groups, research groups outside our own context. Having said this, so one of my backgrounds for participating in the workshop at that time was that I worked myself in international context, particularly on safe, sensitive data across international borders, which was also my background. So I thought it was really fascinating at this workshop because we were a very diverse group, both representing several disciplines and practitioners, data experts, and we had similar views and also experiences, although we had a lot of different attitudes that obviously we need to navigate to find out and also harmonize what did we mean when we were talking and discussing various topics and similar challenges and solutions. But that's maybe also something that you, Kathleen, come to at the end of the summary and the solutions. But that's an experience, of course, you do all the time when you have the researcher perspective and you engage both in international, interdisciplinary, intersectoral research, like I do in my own field. So since the results have been structured very nicely also in the report, and I think we need to recognize there has been some focus, or a lot of focus, on these topics in the international community, on the data sharing from the international perspective. So I'd like to say that as I take the stance from a researcher working internationally, I do not want to pretend that what I say now is something new or not something anybody else has experienced before, because particularly in health research and other areas, there's a lot of information out there, and the challenges, because health data have a very specific basis, which is also highly ethical. So what I will do is just focus on some of the kind of bottom-up experiences that I've made in the area of jurisdictional policy and culture, in particular in my own research field, which I also was the primary interest why I was in this workshop, which deals with war and conflict-related research, which is in per se very often highly sensitive, and in particular children born of war, which is a research field that I've been developing for the past 20 years, and where I work with NGOs, companies, researchers in a lot of various disciplines. So I've probably experienced a lot of the topics that Bob has already addressed. So the presentation was limited to 10 minutes, and I will move to my next slide. And because structuring what I would like to share with you was just, first of all, placing the presentation in the context. As I told you, I have a specific background. I'm a political scientist, but working also with the data. And one of the things we realized in particularly, well, my research field, and when you work internationally and interdisciplinary, is that we need to, when we discuss all the other topics about the complexities of data sharing, we need to also discuss what exactly is the data we're talking about. Coming from a research data infrastructure, which shares data widely, which is representative and anonymized, this is a very specific kind of data, but as we all know, there's administrative data, there's qualitative data, there's satellite pictures, and depending on the research area you work with, you have a lot of various kinds of data sources that may be interesting for research, and which is used increasingly also in order to analyze the complexities of the societal challenges we have today. So all of these different kinds of data, of course, have different perspectives you need to take into account when you talk about data sharing, which is what is anonymization, what is ethical, what is required to share that particular data compared to another one, and how much data or effort or money should be made into making this shareable, which is, in my experience, very often one of the most tricky issues if it's not been considered in the beginning, which again, what I said when I started off, saying that if this is not on the agenda to the people you work with, there's not even money dedicated to it. And then you come to the question, who wants to share, for the various reasons also Bob mentioned, and then who do the data in the end belong to, and who is the author? And I could go on probably with this list for a very long time. So if I take the bottom-up perspective and I've tried to visualize this to give you an indication, maybe, I don't know if it's only me, but this is most of the experience I have with what other researchers think about. So in the center, very often is the question, you have the researcher and you have the research question, the problem statement. What is it that you're interested in, that you want to do? What kind of data is it that you would need in order to analyze that? The methods you use, what would be the perfect partners, which is, again, all of these questions are, of course, also depending on the funding scheme that you deal with. And these are the primary questions that we often ask, and we ask ourselves once we go into the endeavor of starting off or continuing a research project. So as an individual researcher from the bottom up, that is the first thing. And of course, you're embedded in your discipline, sometimes even more disciplines, which guide you from the cultural perspective, maybe often more than we know, how we were trained, how we've been influenced ourselves by using shared data, which you can also see a very big difference, that people are more likely to share data, maybe if they are used to knowing the profit of it. And these attitudes are very different depending on the research collaborations that you have. Then you have the research collaboration, and in all that, in this system of what is guiding us as researchers, of course, you have the laws and the policies. All this operates at the national level, and may be complex enough, but at the international level, this of course increases in complexity when it has to be navigated with all these different areas and also addressing all the questions that I mentioned on my first slide. And I think that is something very often that, of course, we need to take into consideration the laws and policies that are relevant, but very often that is something that's kind of out there that we know we need to, but where in the process is this kind of finding its way in our international research collaboration, and when are these questions addressed? In my experience, far too late in the research collaboration, should be addressed much, much earlier. Looking at the reefs in the sea of the data sharing navigations, that one thing is what I've experienced, but also what has been addressed in the report are different kinds of laws and regulations that we have with regard to both approval, the data archiving, the sharing of the collected data. And yes, it may be argued that ethical boards, and they may decide on whether a research project should be allowed or not, but there may also be differences, and I've experienced that myself in international collaborations, that whereas in one country, the approval was also connecting it to where do you want to have the data afterwards, who should be able to access it, how is it being stored, how is it being anonymized, and that it has to be on safe servers. This exactly the same study had absolutely none of these issues were addressed in the ethical board there. So this is one of the things that then, of course, when you work internationally in research group later on, and then you want to share them, maybe even with people outside the research group or within the research group, and who is going to be allowed to work with the non-anonymized data and so on, this can cause pretty tricky questions and also mistrust amongst the researchers involved.
1 minute.
Yeah, and I'm getting close to the end too. So the various ethical standards and requirements are, well, surprisingly, maybe not streamlined. And also the processes for violations of regulations that are communicated to researchers in case they do not apply to the rules of the data sharing obligations. So as I said, just to finalize, and I have many other points, but we can come back to these details later on. But also just to give you one example of a tricky thing which can happen if you have an international research collaboration and you collect data, you hire people like PhD students in your research projects, and it turns out that due to their citizenship, they may not actually have been allowed to work with that data, and that has not been questioned beforehand. That PhD student would actually then not be able to be on the authorship of own publications, which is a situation I guess none of us want to involve. So navigating in this sea of the Reefs of data sharing and international collaboration, I would, my final statement would just be that although it may not seem so interesting to address all these issues in advance, I always tell people that addressing them early in the process is of benefit to everybody, because they're so difficult to solve once, well, afterwards, when it's basically done. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ingvild. That's such an important point, that we really need to address these issues in advance of getting into the research project itself. And I certainly will be making that point again at the end of the session. So our next presenter is Alison Specht, and Alison is based in Australia, so she may be sleeping right now. But she sent us a video, Alison is an ecosystem research analyst at the Australian Terrestrial Ecosystem Research Network, based at the University of Queensland in Australia. She is currently the co-leader of the Belmont Forum funded Parsec project, her role being to link the domain scientists and data scientists in the project. And she will be discussing today key elements to achieve fair outcomes in international multidisciplinary groups. And now I'd like to just ask Megan to put her video on for us.
Hello, I'm going to talk about some key elements that will enable international multidisciplinary groups better achieve fair outcomes for their work. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians in all nations. I honour their profound connections to land, water, biodiversity and culture, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I'm going to concern myself today with the case of environmental and earth science working groups. These are groups of experts who meet face-to-face or remotely over a sustained period of time around topics of concern which each group member or their organisations have a desire to solve or at least advance. Members are usually chosen for their knowledge and expertise, and perhaps their ability to represent a vested interest. In the environment and earth sciences, national boundaries are irrelevant to most topics, and often few group members will know one another personally in consequence. However, most pertinent to this talk are that the groups are outcome-oriented. For researchers, publications, impact factors and citations are the goal. The same applies to data and code. Here is a depiction of a typical interdisciplinary international working group. Interdisciplinarity and internationality are but two of the sources of diversity in the group. This can also include career stage, organisational type and gender. In consequence, one of the primary targets or purposes of the tasks of the group is to blend independent people, to enable them to work together, to trust one another, to share their intellectual property and their expertise to achieve the common goal and the outcome desired. This is not easy, as trust and purpose takes time to build. And in this, there are many possibilities to support this, but here are two examples. One is that it appears the proportion of women in a group greatly enhances the sense of participant satisfaction that the group is functioning well. Equally, publication rate. Publications increase that sense of purpose, of positive function in the group, and therefore having a flow of publications can be a really positive thing. Of course, underpinning this is providing a secure working environment, starting with the principles: transparency of all the work across all the group members, ethical behaviour and respect for one another and the different parties, both the people and for the work that is in progress. Providing a shared work platform and shared storage space that every member of the group can access and can see is vital. Having regular communication in different ways or forms is also important to keep people up to date, and a system of versioning for the work. So as most of these group members will not be fully employed on the group work, they will step in and out. Knowing where, if one subgroup is doing some work, someone who stepped out can step in and can catch up quickly and therefore contribute meaningfully to the work of the group is really vital. And of course, last but not least, accommodate time zones so everyone has an opportunity to be in their best form for some of the work. Of course, these groups are heading towards a fair outcome. And to help discuss this for the rest of the talk, I'm using a little analogy, which is of the owl and the pussycat who set to sea in a beautiful pea-green boat. So said Edward Lear in a discussion, in a story in the 19th century. I'm quite attracted by this as an analogy because the owl and the pussycat are two completely different beasts and in fact rivals, if not enemies, most of the time. But here they are, collaborating and cooperating in their adventure into the seas. In addition, they have different skills that they bring to bear to their journey and their adventure. The owl is playing a ukulele and singing, in fact, and the cat is making sure the boat is going in the right direction. We'll follow these two animals during the rest of the talk. So first, focus on the researcher. And the first deal is to give each researcher their persistent identifier and make sure that they are activating it to the maximum, so they are maximizing the benefit they get from it. And here we have the owl and the pussycat getting their ORCID ID. The next step is to get a data management plan, or the new generation data and digital object management plan. Make one early. It'd be a data mentor, every team should have one. Would it be great to help the team start their DDOMP and set up an easy-to-follow regular review system for dedicated team members to follow? We've got an example here of our DDOMP for the Parsec project, and which we have found very useful. Version 2, they're a living object. Then, of course, when the group starts their work, they assemble their data, and much of this data comes from their own sources indeed, but also from others, either government or other researchers. So they really need to check the permissions to access and use the other people's data in this way, and code. And while they're checking that license, they should be recording any attribution requirements and, of course, provenance notes. And while they're doing that, they may as well choose the license for their own data that they mean to produce. Then that's done. Of course, choosing a home for their data and code at the end is also something that is well done at the beginning, and we have now these increasing number of trusted repositories which will have some persistence. We hope they'll have quite a lot of persistence, and they also have staff to help the working group in their work, which will make their lives much easier. And in the interim, we mustn't forget a good solution for safe but shared storage sites for work in progress. Then, of course, we need to, when the work is really beginning to start, it's a good thing to start well and to use community-accepted semantic vocabularies when you are blending and harmonizing the data. Then your data, in the end, will be machine discoverable. Make sure you create rich metadata. Make sure the metadata is super rich for reusability and reproducibility of your data and code. Use a recognized dialect, for example, EML or ISO, and include clear licensing statements all along the way, particularly if you're using data or creating data that depends on protected information. So you will get there in the end to publishing data and code, and you will get a persistent identifier for your metadata and code when you deposit in a licensed and trusted repository. for your digital objects, papers, Perl, etc. And this will link to the author's ORCID. And therefore, discovery, citations, reuse, funding, and promotion will all follow. In the Parsec project, we have gathered together most of these objects here, these tasks here, in a Ready Reckoner checklist. And here we have, for example, temporary storage in a Google Drive, Open Science Framework, that will then transfer to our repository, which we've chosen as the Environmental Data Initiative. We have software development being stored in a dedicated GitHub site. We are preserving, when we've created it to a certain degree, our software in Zenodo, and we're also preserving our training and workshop material, conference presentations in Zenodo. So we're getting publications along the way, DOI publications. We're continually updating our ORCID, and of course we're keeping everything transparent by having a Zotero site for our references, so our team members are advantaged and don't have to repeat work. So there are we, I hope, as well as the owl and the pussycat, sailing happily in the fair data seas, with all their equipment in hand, and their publication will be seamless. At least so we hope. And I'd like to thank all of the providers and supporters of the Parsec project, and I'd like to thank you, the audience. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Alison, even though you're not here. So I'd like to just pause perhaps for a few minutes to see if there are any questions for Ingvill or Bob. I saw there was a question in the chat, but it has been answered. So I welcome audience members to go and read that question and Bob's reply to it. Are there any other questions or comments at this time from the audience? All right, seeing nothing, I'm going to share my screen again and go to the second part of the workshop outcomes. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, the second half of the workshop, let me put this in full screen mode. The second half of the workshop was really devoted to kind of brainstorming solutions around how we can address these many challenges. I bring you another quote from one of our other participants, Lindsey, and I'm Poirier from University of California, and she says, to advance international and interdisciplinary collaborations, we need to better understand the unique opportunities and challenges that researchers in many diverse contexts face at multiple scales, alluding again to the complexity of all of this. And this will require devising and applying new frameworks for unpacking diverse data cultures and thinking through how the design of data infrastructures and the development of recommended data practices can be interwoven through them. And so I think this is what we have tried to do with the solution discussion that we had at the workshop. And basically, we came up with 4 recommended iterative steps for those working in international research collaborations to try to enter into the research project with some level of readiness and common understanding about how data will be managed and shared throughout the research project. And I think very important about this is that these steps, these iterative steps, really need to be taken before the project starts, as Ingvill talked about. And the first one for me, I think, is one of the most important steps, which is, and each one of our presenters today talked about the social challenges around data sharing and how those social challenges may be compounded when we're looking at international projects or multidisciplinary projects where the norms might be very different in around how data is shared. So this aspect of building consensus and trust in the research team on the need and benefits for data sharing is very, very important. And usually that will involve some data champions, usually the PIs or others who are really championing the need for data sharing and who are able to articulate well why data sharing is so important. And then the second aspect, which has also been alluded to, is that there are a lot of researchers that just simply don't know how to properly share their data. And, you know, as Ingvild said, this is not on, you know, top of mind for most researchers. They're very good at doing their research, but the data sharing aspect is not something that has necessarily been taught as they were going through graduate school. And there may be certainly gaps in knowledge around how to do that. So coming to a common understanding across the research team about what is needed to make sure that data can be shared both within the project at the time of the project, but also after the project is over, and identifying gaps there, trying to address those gaps either by bringing in specialist expertise or by assigning you know, data management activities to the team members who do have the current expertise. And then the third aspect is really looking at the relevant policy and legal requirements that the research team may be have to adhere to. So again, researchers in different disciplines may have different requirements from their funders. There may be ethical requirements that are different across different institutions or different national boundaries. There may be open science policies in one country and not in another country. So documenting all of those different policies and requirements across the research team and looking at how they align or don't align will be very, very important. And then the fourth aspect that we recommend is developing a data governance framework. So again, even before the research project starts, how will the data be governed in the context of this research team? And trying to change my slide, and I can't. Okay, I think I'm on it. There we go. Whoops. So now the chat box is in my way. So this data governance framework is really kind of just a very hardcore, perhaps more detailed data management plan. And really the kind of things that a framework would look at, and again, this is a very high level at the moment, is, you know, document what kind of data will be produced, who will be responsible in the research team for the various data management activities across the data lifecycle, what are the rights and restrictions related to data sharing for the team, what are the standards that will be used, and Alison spoke about, you know, FAIR requirements and how good they are for ensuring data interoperability. But, you know, what will all those standards that will be needed for ensuring interoperability, discovery, and reuse? What will be the tools and infrastructure? How will the data be collected? Where will it go? Where will it be managed during the research project? Sometimes there's inequality in access to research infrastructures across the team. So should it be centralized or should the data be distributed across the team and things like that? And then what will be the procedures? How will it be managed, the data be managed over time? And what will be the procedures for ensuring data sharing during the project, but also after the project as well? So this is, again, a framework that's presented at a very high level, and most research projects will have to drill down a little bit into this and address even more issues in a more granular way. And some of these issues were already mentioned by Bob and Ingvild and Alison. So what are the responsibilities of the staff and investigators. Who will be doing it? How much time will they be required to spend on all of this? You know, how will the PIs verify that everything is being done according to the plan? When will this all happen during the research project? Who's responsible? How will data be transferred from the team to, you know, an external data provider such as a repository? Who will be making these decisions? And then something Ingvild talked about, which is critical, is how much will this cost, and where will the funding come from for data preparation? So, you know, again, this is a really complex issue. Our framework will be available in a paper coming very soon, but it won't solve all the problems, but it provides a kind of scaffolding for researchers who are entering into an international project to make sure that they've looked at all of the issues that need to be addressed in advance of the project starting. And so with that, I think I'd like to finish my presentation and open up the floor to questions or comments from the audience or the other panelists as well. And I invite Ingvild and Bob to open up their cameras also. So I notice there are a couple comments in the chat. Should I start, Stephanie, with the chat, or, and there's some Q&A as well. Okay, so I'm going to start with the chat. We don't have a lot of time. And I'll start with Irina Vipach Bravar, who says, hi, I would just like to second the importance of checking and following national regulations when conducting international research in DMPs. It makes our lives, and okay, thank you for your comment. Then Anna Lucic says, could you talk a little bit more about the procedures on internal data sharing? The researchers I work with come from different disciplines, and some are in favor of having data access agreements in place for internal data sharing, and some think that any data sharing should happen purely on a voluntary basis, and no access agreements need to be in place to facilitate data sharing. I wonder, Robert, Bob, do you have any comments on that particular?
Surely, yes, I do. I think that's a fantastic question. And it's really a pressing issue on how teams can share data internally when they're working on different aspects of a project. And to that end, my recommendation would be to make the data publicly accessible so that you can share them. That is, put a license on them that allows the data to be used by anybody for any purpose. An example would be the Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 International License, which allows anybody to do anything they want with the data, use them for any purpose, as long as they provide attribution. And so if there's a team that need to share data, and perhaps people coming and going in the team, that is, you have some people who are initially on the team and later others, to try to have agreements or memorandums of understanding between each one could be a nightmare, trying to work out all of those details, where if the licenses are put on the data in advance, then the data can be shared amongst all of the team members and later on even with the public.
Thanks, Bob. Ingvild, do you have anything you'd like to add to that too?
Yes, and unfortunately, I want to add a complexity to what Bob says, which I think, of course, would be the ideal world. But we do have data where you have them, where some of the things you can do in an internal group because of the sensitivity just cannot be just openly shared. So the question would be the balance between what do we want to know So we need to collect that data in order to find out more. But on the other hand, is this the kind of data we can at the same time share, which would be the perfect thing. So, and in those settings, and particularly when they're groups and they're changing groups, I would always say, well, what's wrong with having a kind of an agreement? It's a question of how detailed it is. Usually the problems come up. When the problems come up, then you don't get an agreement. So it's like having a kind of a marriage, like agreement. Then if you have them in the beginning, which is sorting out everything, if any kinds of problems occur, then you don't have to start negotiating them once maybe you have the problem on the desk and you then have to find an agreement and solution. So I would say, yes, the ideal is what Bob says, but the other thing is it has to be dependent on what are the data, what is the group, and these kinds of things. So I don't think there's a kind of a general answer of saying we don't need it or we do need it.
Thanks, Ingvild. There were just a couple of comments here about the paper, which we do hope will be published very soon. We're just trying to decide what would be the best way to disseminate it. It's essentially finished, and if you're interested, you could send me an email directly, and I can share the preprint, shall we say, with you. Stephanie, do I have time for one more comment in the Q&A? You're shaking your head. No.
I can certainly put it in a, is it a quick one, like 1 minute, or I can put it in a spreadsheet and we get the answer and I can send it off to everybody.
I'll just read it quickly, okay? It's becoming difficult for universities and libraries to maintain their own data repositories, but at the same time, data repository platforms are expensive. What would be the best way for institutions who are just starting their RDM program, develop their own data repository or pay for services? Yeah, that's a complex question. I'd be happy to take a stab at that, because I really think shared infrastructure is the way to go. So I feel that in the beginning, we thought about repositories as being, either domain or institution based. But I hope in the next 5 years, we can start thinking about models where institutions and domains are sharing some of the costs, and institutions across institutions are sharing some of the costs of that infrastructure. So that's my quick answer to that question. And I think I need to turn it over to Stephanie now to wrap things up. So thank you again, everyone, for attending the webinar.
Thank you, Kathleen. Thank you to all the presenters today. I just wanted to say a couple of things. We have the RDA US is hosting 3 more webinars over the end of September and October. We have the FAIR for Research Software Work Group presenting the FAIR Principles of Research Software. On October 7th, we have the RDA ESIP Physical Samples webinar series supporting interdisciplinary sample data discovery, integration, and reuse. That's a mouthful. And then on the 21st, was what was mentioned before, is we are going to be presenting a webinar on how to get attention for your research projects. And it will be given by Jennifer Gibson, the Director of Communications. So that's to help our working groups and RDA members and chairs help with their project outputs. And anyone's invited. You don't have to be a chair of a work group, but we'd love to see you there. We do have Plenary 18 coming up in November. And we do have 1 more preliminary, or 2 more preliminary help webinars to get people oriented for that. And I think it's time already, but if you're not already a member of RDA, we do encourage you to please become a member and look at the website for RDA newcomers if you're not familiar with RDA. And I want to thank everyone on behalf of the RDA US for joining us today. And thank you, Megan, for the technical support. I think that's it. It's a wrap. Thank you for coming.